This morning, I want to speak about what is really just one small verse in the Talmud that is, I think, important and consequential and challenging and worth thinking about. The verse is found in Tractate Brachot, the first tractate of the Talmud, on the 8th folio. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Ami mishmei de Ulla. So taught Rabbi Chia bar Ami in the name of Ulla. Miyom shecharav Beit HaMikdash. From the day that the temple was destroyed, Ein lo lakadosh baruch hu ba'olamo ela arba amot shel halacha bilvad. The Holy One resides only in the 4 cubits of halacha. What is this saying trying to explain? What is the story that it's trying to tell? From the day the temple was destroyed, the Holy One resides only in the 4 amot. An amma is a measurement. The 4 amot of halacha. Well, about 2,000 years ago, Judaism faced the biggest trauma in its history since at least slavery in Egypt, and that was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. In a very short amount of time, our religion, which was based on the ceremony of the temple, that was the religion called Judaism, it was gone. And frankly, it could have been the end of Judaism, and it's a rather remarkable accident of history that it was not the end of Judaism. How did Judaism survive after the temple's destruction? The story is encapsulated in the tale of a rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the Mishnah's first sages, who resurrects Judaism following the temple's destruction. He is smuggled out of a burning Jerusalem in a coffin. It's an incredible story. He predicts the Emperor Vespasian's ascent. He was just a general at that time, ascent to the imperial throne, and tells the emperor, "Give me Yavne and its sages." His request was granted. Yavne was a nondescript, nothing town in the Galilee of no particular note, but he settled there. He built a Beit HaMidrash, a house of study. He acquired many students. He began transcribing and collecting the oral tradition, and this gave rise to Rabbinic Judaism, the Rabbinic revolution of Judaism, which is the religion that we practice and know today. Miyom shecharav Beit HaMikdash, from the day the temple was destroyed, Ein lo lakadosh baruch hu ba'olamo ela arba amot shel halacha. The Holy One resides only in the 4 corners of halacha. The temple is gone, but we assert that the closest we come to it is actually not by visiting the Western Wall, not by coming to synagogue, not even by reading rituals from the time of the temple like we did this morning in Parashat. How do we come close to God? How do we have an experience that could be likened in any way to the experience of visiting the temple? It is by studying and living halacha. Halacha means the path. It tells us how we should observe Shabbat, the holidays, the dietary laws. It tells us how to pray, how to give tzedakah, how to handle ethical questions. Halacha is sacred speech, social interaction, business ethics, family life, how we relate to each other, how we relate to God. It is usually translated as Jewish law, but the translation is really insufficient, even stifling. Halacha is simply the way Jews live. It is the way we take the 613 mitzvot of the Torah and live them out practically in our lives. Since the destruction of the temple, halacha is the space where Judaism has lived. Differences always existed in practice between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews and Yemenite Jews and Moroccan Jews and other Jewish communities which historically lived in isolation, but all lived a Judaism that was based on law and rabbinic authority to interpret that law. That is not to say that halakha has not faced its challenges. Whether it was the Karaites of the 8th century or the reformers of the 19th century, halakha has had its ideological and theological critiques, particularly because of a paradox that lies at the core of halakha. To understand the paradox, think about the story told in this morning's Parsha about the deaths of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu. There are at least 24 explanations for their deaths that you'll find as you go through the sources. It is an incident indeed clouded in mystery. But many of these explanations find fault for them seeking to approach and worship God in their own way, in the way that they see fit, and not within the confines of halakha. Perhaps they were drunk. Perhaps they decided a matter of religious law themselves without consulting Moses. The paradox at the core of halakha is that in order to be liberated, you need limits. In order to have freedom, you need boundaries. In order to be creative, you need discipline. In my Seder class, Passover Seder class this year, I said, think about the fact that the holiday of freedom is celebrated with a Seder. Seder means order. Think of the paradox and what's being told through that message. In order to be creative, you need discipline. Every artist knows at the borders of the canvas lie the ends of their creativity. Nadav and Avihu could not operate within that system. Limits, boundaries, discipline, it just didn't resonate with them. That was their theological struggle. But does it sound familiar? It seems that this is our theological struggle as well. If God resides in the 4 cubits of halakha and only there, what does that mean to those of us who struggle with halakha? What does it mean to those who are halakhically illiterate? We live in an age of unsurpassed freedom comfort, we have endless choices. A system that by definition limits our choices is bound to face resistance. Will the unobservant ever be able to enter the room where God resides? Let me suggest an alternative. Perhaps the Talmud is telling us something quite profound, not about where God lives, but about the role and function of halakha in Judaism. And that is that halakha ought to be considered a home. Why a home? In Jewish law, 4 cubits is the measurement which defines personal space. So when we say that God resides in the 4 cubits of halakha, perhaps the learning is that halakha ought to feel for every Jew like a home. Think about that. In one sense, I think it is certainly true that halakha is the collective home of the Jewish people. When we had a temple, the temple was the Jewish home, and every Jew contributed to it with a half shekel contribution. Halakha enables us to sustain that feeling of home, even when it doesn't exist physically. If we did not have a halakha, a common understanding of the do's and don'ts, we would not be able to gather to practice our religion. We wouldn't know what to do. Halakha gives us centrality and stability. And we can contribute to halakha as every generation before has contributed to it, facing the ethical, moral, and ritual challenges of our day, building that home up, sometimes by adding, sometimes by modifying, sometimes by replacing, but always keeping the system intact. In another sense, halakha ought to feel like home for the individual Jew as well. The genius of the halachic system is that it is not only about a physical place, the temple or the synagogue. It is about how we conduct ourselves personally in our daily lives, no matter where we live, as long as we are striving to live our lives in accordance with halakha's teachings, we are home. If you think about it, the idea of home, halakha as a home, it helps explain why we need this system in the first place. A religion based on peoplehood has to have common limits, common rituals, common practices. The system itself allows for flexibility and variety in practice, but that flexibility is not infinite. At a certain point, you have moved out of the house. Particularly in today's conservative movement, we are losing that sense of cohesiveness that once bound us to that home. In our synagogues, why is it that halakha has become a dirty word? Halakha is that annoying thing that the rabbi invokes when he wants to ignore surveys and board votes, which really ought to define the way a synagogue operates. We used to believe in protecting and defending our rituals and our boundaries because they binded us to our history and binded us to each other. Today, we are anxious to toss them away. We're more interested in convenience, relevance, being welcoming. You do not have to observe halacha in order to feel at home with halacha. Tefillah b'tzibur, praying together, Shabbat, the dietary restrictions, covenant, Jews marrying other Jews. These ideas are at the core of traditional Judaism. And once upon a time, even if you didn't follow them personally, they were still your home. You would still appreciate their importance. The importance of having those boundaries. The importance of a halachic system interpreted with rabbinic authority. Once upon a time, I could never imagine a Dvar Torah at a shul board meeting actually questioning many of these ideas, challenging them. Today I hear them all the time. Like many conservative synagogues, ours finds itself in a difficult moment, facing very difficult choices. And yes, there are questions we have to ask about the direction of the community, but there are personal questions that must be confronted as well. Where is my home? Where do I feel at home? Where ought I pitch my tent? If your desire is to be at home with a community that believes that halakha is outdated and ought to be radically reimagined, there is a different movement out there for you. Believe me, I grew up in the Reform movement. I wrote my senior thesis at JTS on the religious thought of Abraham Geiger. I love my colleagues in the Reform movement, but the Judaism that they practice is not normative, not theologically, not historically. They moved outside of the home and sadly are moving further and further away, creating rifts in the Jewish world that I'm not sure will ever be repairable. I understand that many conservative Jews practice a Judaism in their private lives that is basically indistinguishable from their Reform friends. But the difference between us and the Reform is the way we regard halakha as our home. The conservative Jew values halakha as home, defending its importance. In the Sephardic world, this is very common. Sephardic Jews may not keep every law, but they respect and revere it. And if their Sephardic synagogue or their Sephardic rabbi chose to act outside the system, it would be the end. In 1925, the great Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig wrote a letter to his friend Joseph Prager. It's a fascinating letter. At the time, Prager was in this same struggle. He could not appreciate, couldn't understand, couldn't observe this thing called halakha, and he asked for guidance from his friend. Rosenzweig suggests to his friend something beautiful, and I think it's appropriate for the message I'm trying to deliver today, and I want to share it with you. He says to his friend Prager, "Why don't you set up your tent just outside of the building of halakha? The protection over your head will not be the same as the roof that halakha provides. And yet, the placement of your tent across from the entry to the world of halakha indicates that even you, as a non-halachic Jew, continues to live his life in relationship to normative community life. Over time, writes Rosenzweig, as more and more tents are erected on the front lawn, the building of halakha may move and expand. That is the self-reform that characterizes the halachic system. It never fully excludes Jews who live according to their ability. It always has a place for them. It insists, no matter what your personal practice, stay in the neighborhood. Maintain a relationship with the communal norm. Rosenzweig's image of setting a tent right outside of the edifice, that strong building, the home of halakha, is an appropriate message for what I think I'm trying to say today. I'll say it again. I am well aware that many of us do not yet have a life that will allow us to live inside of the halachic home. But for the thoughtful among us, I say, don't move to a different neighborhood. Don't leave. Pitch a tent. Be right outside. Appreciate the beauty of this tradition. Do the best you can to be a part of it. Come to shul, even if you don't understand everything that's going on. Invest in your Jewish education, even if you have to start from square one. And certainly invest in the Jewish education of your children. Be a part of the life of the community. Set halachic boundaries whenever and wherever you are able to do so, even if you can't do it always. Don't criticize the boundaries and those who set them. Defend them and realize that without them, we would be homeless and probably would not be around today. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Ami Mishmei de Ula. So taught Rabbi Chia bar Ami in the name of Ula. Miyom shecharav Beit HaMikdash, from the day the temple was destroyed. Ein lo lakadosh baruch hu ba'olamo. The Holy One has nowhere to live in this world. Ela arba amot shel halacha. But he lives in the four corners of halacha. Maybe over the years and generations, the infrastructure of our home will expand. Actually, I'm sure it will. I don't know how. Only time will tell. But if you are willing to stay in these arba amot, I promise you that you will benefit. Here, there is uplift. Here, there is spirituality. There is growth. There is a sense of affiliation. There is identity. There is connection. Here in the halachic home, we stand once again in the magnificence and the glory of the Holy Temple, and we don't even have to leave our homes. We acknowledge and appreciate its gates and boundaries, because we know that these allowed us to meet God's presence in the past and will allow us, with God's help, to do the same today and in the future. Shabbat Shalom. Continue.